Okay, welcome everyone to the X Umbrellas podcast. Scholarch McLarney here, and with me is
Schoolman Fawcett, yes, and we are teachers, headmaster, and supporting teacher, I suppose you'd call me. I don't know what underling teacher at Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center, the world's only online Chesterton Academy. So we offer a joyfully Catholic classical education, and if you'd like to know what it's like to be in an online class at Chesterton Academy, this podcast is meant to answer that question. So our conversations kind of replicate what a lesson might be like, what one of our meets might be like. So,
and today we're going to be a little free-flowing, I believe. We're talking about an eclectic range of texts. I'm not entirely privy to the extent of where we're going to take
neither
this.
am I. No,
Okay.
this one. Okay, typically, of course, Well, here's how the sausage is made a little bit at the X Umbrellas podcast.
All right.
I think, in a class, obviously. Well, this is getting really meta, but let's step back a bit, right?
Sure.
We in education tend to think of it as being lecture based, right? In the Middle Ages, that was not necessarily the case altogether, right? As we've discussed before, the trivium was grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So you learned grammar, which meant obviously it was language, but you had to. They didn't have a class on literature. They didn't have a class on history. You learned Latin, but the way you learned it was by going through the Bible, going through histories, going through poetry. And so you assimilated all this knowledge by virtue of that. Then there was logic, which was reasoning about it, and rhetoric is about the communication. And that was often done in the disputation format.
Okay.
And so this happened in classrooms. Disputations were also like a big public event. There's a very famous disputation at Barcelona between a Jewish convert to Christianity and a rabbi over whether Jesus was the Messiah or not. This was a big public event, right?
Yeah.
And so obviously Jewish people weren't treated very well by the Christians, but the church was actually very open to having these debates publicly. So it was dialogical. It was like the Socratic dialogues, of course, and that's captured in Aquinas' Summa. Right, the dialogical format of the disputation.
Right.
There's objections, there's responses to the objections, all based, and they're always based on authorities, right? Augustine seems to say this, and well, actually, if you read him rightly, he's saying this. That's very much how it worked. You started with these sentences that Peter Lombard had compiled from the scriptures and the church fathers, and they debated about their meanings. So that's a traditional model, actually, of a classroom. It's rooted in shared authorities that everyone studied, but then it's conversational and it's discussion based. So of course what we try to do is we have students do the readings in advance so that our meets can be mostly dialogical, with guided by us as the instructors, but it's not fundamentally us just talking at the students. It's more that we are all together learning from the classics, from the authorities.
Right.
So normally when we have a podcast episode, it's a bit like I think what our lessons are like, where we have a kind of script, obviously. We have things we want to talk about, but then obviously we want to have it as open to disputatio or dialogue between us as possible. Today, we've had various conversations both on and off camera that are a bit like what would you call it? They're fragmentary. And I just thought, today let's just kind of see if we can pull them all together on camera. This is a more freewheeling, as you would say. It's a bit of a dice roll whether this will even be successful.
Okay.
But I'll just kind of broadly say what we're talking about today. Our topic is Jurassic Park the Garden of Eden? Right? So starting with Frankenstein, looking at Jurassic Park, and looking at this through a classical Catholic lens. Like, what do these classics, we'll say, have to teach us about science and about our mission in the world?
Okay, so from the Garden of Eden to Geneva to Costa Rica.
Yes, absolutely. Right, exactly.
This is where we're going.
Ooh, that's lovely. That's a great way of putting it. Well, what inspired it? Well, so you and I both teach Frankenstein.
Yeah.
I do it for, St. Isidore Learning Center offers other programming besides Chesterton Academy. And part of our literature class is looking at Frankenstein. It's also part of the Chesterton Academy curriculum for grade 12. So we both teach Frankenstein to our students.
Yep.
And so I know we've talked a little bit about the content of that. And I was inspired specifically by our episode that we recorded on how to read a movie. Classically.
Okay.
So we talked in there about how to read scripture according to the church fathers and the medievals, right? There's the 4 layers of interpretation, and we applied that to the Bourne identity and the Bourne original trilogy, right?
Yeah.
Now, shortly after we discussed that, I watched the Jurassic Park movie from 1993, the original Jurassic Park. I had it on in the background. When you have a newborn, you don't necessarily sit down to watch a movie with your full attention. But of course, it's a filmite scene, so I thought this is going to be a comforting thing to have on it. Of course, it's comforting. The dinosaurs ravaging, an island in the dark and the rain. It's comfort food if
Obviously,
you've seen it already.
sure,
Obviously,
okay.
it's great viewing for like a small child, right? A newborn infant. It's a good thing to expose them to fresh into the world. And as it was playing in the background, though, I still had this in my mind of, well, how do you interpret a movie allegorically, right? Or morally and symbolically as well as literally. And I was noticing things in Jurassic Park that were reminding me a little bit of the story of Scripture.
Oh,
right?
Okay. In what sense?
Well, first of all, so let's recapitulate the four senses of Scripture.
Oh, okay.
Right? That Dante applies that to his own writings, and that kind of gives us a warrant for saying, well, I'll say all literature you can look at through those lenses, and if it doesn't work, that's a reflection on the literature itself. Right?
Okay.
If you can't get a moral or allegorical meaning out of a literature or a movie, that's not a failure of the method; it's a failure of the movie.
Okay.
Right? Something that can hold up to all four of those is a classic.
Ah.
But let's say the four senses of Scripture are the literal. Sure, that's foundational. And then you have the three spiritual senses,
Right.
which would be what? Allegorical.
There's the allegorical. There's the moral and the anagogical.
Anagogical, which is, I think, the trickiest one for some people to understand. How would you break down the anagogical sense?
Well, it's future eschatology usually. So anagogical is how things will play out in the end. So in light of heaven, hell, death, judgment, that forward-looking sense of where all things are oriented to. I guess in some ways you can think of it as a teleological approach, a reading of things.
Sure, okay. So like an eschatological, I guess, too, which we should probably do an episode on eschatology or the Book of Revelation and when it was written. That could be a topic.
Right.
So I think, first of all, what was just striking me was that Jurassic Park begins as an idyllic, Edenic, a paradisical situation, right? Yep. It's an island that is, it's inaccessible. Like you have, John Hammond owns it, and it's intentionally supposed to be as closed a system as possible.
Who's John Hammond again?
Well, John Hammond is in the book he's the villain, I'd say, and in a sense he's a villain in the movie too, but he's portrayed more sympathetically. But Jurassic Park is his idea. He runs InGen, right, the corporation that's doing the cloning, and he wants to create a theme park using genetic engineering and cloning to entertain kids.
Okay.
And though in the book he's very crass and mercenary about it. He's very explicit. He says it's just for the rich kids because I want to make money off this. Okay. In the movie he's very benevolent in his intentions, and he says, his lawyer tells him, we're going to make a fortune off this, and he says, no, I want all children to enjoy this.
Oh,
right?
okay.
The lawyer says, well, maybe we can have a coupon day, but he's very, he's very genuine. He's like Disney-esque in the movie in his desire for everybody to come enjoy Jurassic Park.
They've toned him down a little bit then in the film.
Yes, they've made it. Well, they've made it. The movie is very much about the failure of good intentions. Right, the road that's paved with good intentions.
Oh, I see.
Whereas the book is more about the root of all evil, being the love of money in some ways.
Right.
So, but that's thinking of this island, this idyllic island where there's this hope that humans will be able to live in harmony with these prehistoric animals. Yeah. I was thinking about this. Well, Jurassic broadly, you could say, means like ancient.
Right.
And a park, well, it's kind of like a garden. It's like Eden, right? So it just struck me, like, even the title.
Set apart.
Right, the title is like an Arcadian situation, right? Okay. So even the title, Jurassic Park, almost evokes the Garden of Eden, like the ancient park, the ancient Eden, right? The ancient garden in some ways.
Okay, is that enough to go on, though?
Well, I think then you have to press further and say, okay, well, what's it about? And it's broadly about this desire to use the human scientific powers and capabilities, our understanding of the world and our creativity, to create something that's meant for our pleasure, our delight, our entertainment. Right. And it all goes completely wrong. It gets out of hand. It gets out of our control and ends up turning on us and almost destroying us. Right. And that seems allegorical of what's going on in the Garden of Eden. I think there's a moral thing that's going on too, especially in the movie. But right there's an allegory. There's the story of Eden, which is of course already laden with allegory, kind of being retold, right, or depicted. I went and I pulled up the catechism actually for this. expecting this might come up. This is a paragraph 396 of the Catholic Catechism. All right. God created man in his image and established him in his friendship. A spiritual creature, man can live this friendship only in free submission to God. The prohibition against eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil spells this out. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolically evokes the insurmountable limits that man, being a creature, must freely recognize and respect with trust. Man is dependent on his creator and subject to the laws of creation and to the moral norms that govern the use of freedom. I'll hone in on that sentence in the middle. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolically evokes the insurmountable limits that man, being a creature, must freely recognize and respect with trust. That seems to be what's going on in Jurassic Park as well. As represented by...
Well, how's it going? Freely recognize the limits?
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolically evokes the insurmountable limits that man, being a creature, must freely recognize and respect with trust.
With trust. Okay, yeah, right. Okay, so
so
this is an act of faith. The laws have been made that we can't transgress, but this is part of the paradox of that freedom which we have through submission. And so this... knowing we're delimited or finite creatures thus enables us both to have freedom but also to know there are limits to what we can accomplish or do or should do. And so this is an act of trust as well.
Yes.
In the what we call laws of nature, the created realm, the order which we find ourselves, this world in which I mean, we can engineer or manipulate and to go this way or to go that way, but there's certain...
Well, there's two elements, right? That last sentence is, man is dependent on his creator and subject to the laws of creation and to the moral norms that govern the use of freedom. So there's two... Well, I guess there's three. I mean, well, there's the submission to the creator, and that takes kind of two forms.
Right.
Subjection to the laws of nature and subjection to the moral norms that govern the use of freedom. And I think... What I take that to mean is there are laws of nature that if you try to break them, they will redound on you and kill you. And then there's others that you can break those laws of nature, but then you're really evil.
Okay.
That's what I get from it. And Jurassic Park is in a lot of ways, maybe you can't violate one without violating the other.
Right, okay, so...
But Jurassic Park is it's a hubristic thing, and this is famously represented in the character of Ian Malcolm, who's portrayed by Jeff Goldblum in the movie.
Okay.
Ian Malcolm is he's the mathematician character, right? Who's a big proponent of chaos theory.
Oh, right. Yes.
Now, do you want to speak to chaos theory? You were just discussing it with our vice principal moments before we started recording.
From what I remember now, full disclosure, I've never seen the movie, but I did read the book. Now, this is back.
The movie takes that pretty verbatim, the discussion.
Is it? Okay, yeah, back in the 90s. So, but I mean, my memory's not the best, but I do remember this explanation given for chaos theory from the book. So Michael Crichton does a great job of explicating this notion. And well, correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I recall, it's the subtlest change can have a great effect in a wider scope. So the example given is the butterfly flapping its wings, in, let's say in Beijing, and this results in some thunderstorm, and halfway across the Pacific or the Atlantic, right, and so on. So it's this. There's a connectivity between cause and effect that might not be perceptible, but given the permutations and combinations that it can occur, there is a great change which can result from our seemingly slight actions or our subtle interventions and so on.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and that the more complex a system is, the more unpredictable the results of an action will be.
Okay.
So the image that's it's verbally explained in the book and it's enacted in the movie is if you have a hand, like a palm or like the back of a hand, and you drop a droplet of water on the exact same spot, you cannot predict which direction that will roll.
Okay.
Right. No matter even if you had all the information right? And the exact same conditions.
Really?
It still, chaos theory would posit, right? Like you wouldn't necessarily know down which ridges, right? Because there's so much complexity involved. So there's an inherent unpredictability. Now, John Hammond and his people maintain that he's got the best scientists in the world on this.
Okay.
That on Jurassic Park, they've so designed it that they know exactly what the animals should eat and would eat. They know what climate they need. They've perfectly created it such that these animals will be able to live there. They're not going to all die, but also that they can contain them. So they need some chemical or they need to be administered to, or they'll die in 12 hours, right? So that even if they get off the island, like they wouldn't be able to survive there.
Yeah.
What else? He's taking all these precautions. Oh, they can't breed because they're all female, right? So they won't get out of control. They're able to control the population rigorously. Like they've taken every step. There's a kind of godlike control that John Hammond has over this little island.
Okay.
And Ian Malcolm, the mathematician, maintains it doesn't matter how careful you are. The world is just too complex. It will never be under your control. Something is. Not just that it could happen. Malcolm maintains it will eventually happen. And in fact, there is a character. And of course, something does go wrong. Several things go wrong. Yep. And famously, this goes to the moral meaning, which I hope we'll talk about later. Okay. But there's two children in the book, right? Named Murphy. Right. And the girl's name is Lex Murphy.
Lex Murphy.
Right. Okay. So our friend Michael Crichton is really telegraphing here, in the name of this character, that Murphy's law is true.
Yeah. Well, some of our listeners may not be students of Latin. So what is Lex?
Lex is a law.
Okay. So
right?
it's
that's
for Latin term for.
It's the Latin word for law, and of course we have lots of legislation comes from it and so forth. And so Lex Talionis, right? The law of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. So Murphy, and so. Now you've got the Latin. Yeah. Some of our listeners may not know what Murphy's Law is. How would you paraphrase Murphy's Law?
Murphy's Law is essentially what can go wrong will go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Given enough time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think they were using this during post-World War II, I want to say, with their military experimentations and so on of rocketry and so on. But what could go wrong?
Yeah, basically, I think crudely put, even if there's a really small risk of it happening, like if you do it enough, eventually that you're going to hit that that statistical probability is going to come up, and things will go wrong.
So plan for it.
And of course, it's when Lex Murphy arrives on the island is exactly when things do deteriorate.
Things go sideways. Okay.
In that, so this is Malcolm's. There's something very reverent about this mathematician, Ian Malcolm, saying you are trying to assume a kind of omnipotence and omniscience that you just don't have. And of course, this is what happens, right? Because what's of course happened is they've been able to clone dinosaurs because they were able to get a hold of blood from dinosaurs that had been sucked by mosquitoes that had been preserved in resin, Yeah. So they take the DNA out, they get the blood out of those preserved fossilized mosquitoes, and then they're able to clone the DNA from their blood. This is explained in a wonderful animated sequence in the movie. Sure. But there's gaps in the genome sequence, so they've had to fill it in with other animals.
Okay.
Without putting much thought into, it doesn't matter, right? all DNA is basically the same. Sure. So they've used frog DNA, and frogs, when necessary, to support their population, can apparently switch sexes.
Right.
They can turn from female to male.
Okay.
And these dinosaurs, some of the dinosaurs, the ones specifically that have the frog DNA in them, have been able to
do so.
They've evolved this capacity.
Okay.
So, sure enough, despite all the attempts to forecast every possible problem, they missed at least that one, yes. And so I think this is related to this idea that man is dependent on his creator and subject to the laws of creation and to the moral laws that govern the use of freedom. That would be the laws of creation, right? It's imprudent to try to clone dinosaurs because you just don't have that capacity to understand everything that will happen in the laws of creation. You've got to respect, and this is Ian Malcolm's point, that in a sense, nature decided that there shouldn't be dinosaurs anymore.
Right.
You've decided you know better than nature. Yeah. You do not.
Okay.
Right? So respect what nature has done.
Right.
And he even uses sort of theistic language at some point. So I'll get into that later.
Okay.
I think that's one. That's a moral element of Jurassic Park, and an allegorical one because this kind of gets to this question of what is going on in the Garden of Eden story, right? Why is it that eating this fruit resulted in the fall of man. Now, we touched on this a bit in our very first podcast series, I think, about the angels, but let's, how would you explain it? How do you explain this to your children, for example? What the meaning of that event of Adam and Eve taking the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and eating it? What is conveyed to us?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's interesting is for one, the rules that Eve adds on to the law, you shall not eat of it. Well, she adds, you shall not even touch the tree. And so there's this, in one sense, how would you say this? There's knowledge of the rules and knowledge of what should or should not be done. But then there's like, well, but that doesn't apply to me. So that in a sense is a moral act of pride, right? It's placing ourselves in the stead of God. So it's saying, okay, well, this is what the Lord has said, but now this is what we're going to do instead. And I mean, the serpent doesn't, pluck the apple from the tree. He doesn't wash it for them. He doesn't dice it for them or peel it and put it on a platter. It's something, certainly temptations involved, but it's something that they, of their own freedom, or perverted their own freedom, but as no longer as an act of submission, but rebellion. And as such, this wreaks havoc in the created world. It wreaks havoc in the relationship between Adam and Eve themselves, so within human relations, and then above all, between humanity and God. So on those three levels, nature, humanity, and the divine, there's this rupture which occurs. And so when God asks, where are you? It's not because, the divine GPS is not working that day, or it's been too cloudy, or something's gone wrong with the wiring.
It's not like Jurassic Park, where Dennis Nedry has shut down all of the security systems.
And we got to restore the electrical power, something like this. But rather, this is an occasion for repentance. Again, it's a moral disposition with which can be rectified, or ought to be. And certainly, this is giving the occasion then for Adam to confess, which he is inclined to point, with both hands, one at God and one at Eve, saying, well, you made her and she gave it to me, so why are you looking at me? And so this is the propensity of the human condition ever since, is to strive towards or cling towards, I guess, a self-centered, deflective look where, it's not my fault, but it is someone else's, and so this is, I guess, that's, put it this way, it's what one of the more profound truths, I suppose, is rooted in there, in how we behave. I guess. I mean, there's more to say than that, but that's certainly part of it. Yeah. So there's that upping of the prohibition, right? You won't even you shouldn't even touch the tree. That's not what God said, right? God did not say don't ever touch the tree. He said don't take the fruit and eat it. Yeah. Right. There's this kind of question about were they never ever going to have access to this fruit? Okay.
Or were they supposed to grow up into a point where at one point they would have the maturity that God could sort of give them access to that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, right?
Okay.
Well, I don't want to get into that necessarily, but what is interesting is the point isn't you can't do anything around the tree. It's not, God never said don't touch the tree, but don't grasp after it for yourself.
Right.
Don't reach out and seize it. Basically,
sure,
I would say. It's like you said, the devil doesn't even do that for her. Eve and Adam do it themselves.
Right.
Reach out and touch the. And then after they realize they've sinned, once again, like you said, they don't repent. They reach out and grab some leave and try to fix the problem themselves. Right. They try to maintain some kind of control over the situation.
Yeah.
And ultimately, God has to come, deal with the situation, provide them with clothing themselves, right? Provided from the skins of the fur of animals and so forth. And I think there's something about that in Jurassic Park also. It's interesting because John Hammond, the owner of Jurassic Park, the owner of the island, the gardener in some ways of the Garden of Eden, that is Jurassic Park, the ancient park.
Yeah.
His name is John.
Yeah.
Ian Malcolm, who's the critic, he's the arch critic. And the movie, well, this is in the book too. The book makes the point that Ian Malcolm wears all black.
Right.
Because he doesn't want variation. It's almost like a chaos theory thing, right? You minimize the amount of complexity, right?
And I wonder, I mean, just stretching there, if it's imitating, say, like philosophers of the ancient world would wear certain garb that is distinctive, or even clergy, right? Distinctive garb.
Well, I wonder. I mean, I know I'm overthinking this, but just because Crichton wasn't thinking of this doesn't mean God wasn't. But because in the movie, John Hammond wears all white. All the time, whereas Ian Malcolm wears all black.
Okay.
So they're obviously contrasts, and John Hammond is optimistic and hopeful. Of course, Jurassic Park will be a wonderful success.
Right.
Ian Malcolm is sort of dour and pessimistic, and turns out to be right.
Yeah.
But the name Ian is actually, if you look it up, it's the same name as John.
Oh.
Etymologically, sort of like Mitchell and Michael are the same name.
Okay.
So, and that name John means gift.
Okay.
Right, as we know, John the Baptist, right, is the gift,
Right.
to Zechariah, and then the other protagonist, he's the paleontologist. His name is Dr. Grant.
Okay.
And Grant also means gift.
Okay.
Right. So you have these three characters whose names are all gift.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the attitude that we should have towards nature. Is that we ourselves are a gift. Right. A gift of God, and we need to not have that attitude of we need to seize control of it and try to use it for our own purposes. Now, what I'm overthinking is Malcolm. First of all, our last episode was on Macbeth, and of course, the Christian king in that was named Malcolm.
Yes.
The name Malcolm actually means a devotee of Saint Columba. Mal, I guess, was a sort of the Gaelic term maybe for monk, and Colm is like short for Columba, right? So a monk of Columba. So there is something like monkish or priestly almost about Ian Malcolm, who comes to kind of warn that no, this Promethean endeavor is going to fail, right? You are taking the role of God, and it's not going to be successful. And that idea of this is what's interesting about both John Hammond in the book and in the movie. Like I said, in the book he's very capitalistic. He wants to run the park for money. In the movie he's very idealistic. Right. He wants to make a park that will delight his grandchildren and all children. But they're still in both cases using the dinosaurs, right? He's not creating dinosaurs because dinosaurs are wonderful in themselves, right? They're good creatures that have goodness by their own virtues. He essentially wants to use them for the same reason you would build like a Chuck E. Cheese animatronic, right? Like I mean, it's noble intention, I suppose, right? He wants to delight children in the world around, but it's still use. It's still utilitarian.
Right.
It's not viewing them as a gift that God gave and took away. All right, like Job's attitude towards his own situation, right? Or understanding that like God had his own plan for them. The movie ends with this wonderful shot as they're being airlifted off the island on this helicopter. Dr. Grant kind of, everyone's falling asleep, because they're exhausted from the adventure they've been on. Grant looks out the window and he sees birds flying. Okay. And of course, birds are said to have evolved from dinosaurs, right? So it's almost as if like I take what the director Steven Spielberg is saying to be like, you don't need to save the dinosaurs, God already did. Right? This is the way he's preserved them. We already have them around us. The world's already wonderful. Accept this gift already. You don't have to go out and seize the fruit and try to use it for your own purposes, right?
Okay.
That's again, this is the allegorical and sort of moral meaning that I take from it. I think there's also a moral message about children, but I want to save that till after we talk about Frankenstein.
Okay.
Did I want to dwell on this any further? Well, what are your thoughts? What's your first thought about that?
Well, yes, gift, I think, is a fundamental disposition or an antidote, really, to the dilemma that of the garden, right? Because as opposed to exerting one's will by transgressing moral boundaries, gift is a disposition where we look at the world as something that doesn't have to be here, and we don't have to be here, but it is. So there's a certain profound respect for this time and space in which we find ourselves within, as opposed to thinking, well, I know better, and let me use my God-given gifts to alter what has already been set before me. right?
Yeah,
As
right.
opposed to beautifying or enhancing it, or that living out that vocation to glorify God
There.
and his
That's a key thing. Yeah,
creative role.
beautifying it. Yeah, that's something else I wanted to touch on. Well, first of all, I'll say as well, and this is in the book very strongly,
Yeah.
that exploitation is not limited to nature.
Okay.
Because this is another reason why things go wrong. The movie hints at this but doesn't give lots of details. But in the book, it's very explicit that Nedry, the trader, right, who's going to try to sell, shuts everything off so that he can rush off and do corporate espionage, right, sell trade secrets to the rival company. But the reason why the movie makes Nedry sort of this comical villain, this big, overweight dude, right, who's sort of villainous and comedic. It's the same guy who was the bad guy on Seinfeld, right?
Okay.
But in the book, he's not sympathetic, but they make a point that he's underpaid, right? John Hammond cuts costs, right? He spares no expense when it comes to the dinosaurs, but he's not interested in paying a just wage for his work, and he makes obscene demands of them, and then doesn't really respect them or listen to them or pay them. Yeah. So there's an exploitative attitude towards his fellow human being, right? Again, because they're for use, right? They're not ends in themselves in some ways. So there's an economic message there as well, I think. And then, of course, then Nedry gets blamed. Right? Oh, it's his fault, that he didn't, the Nedry you gave to be with me, he's the one, right, who shut down all the security systems in Jurassic Park. It's like Adam, Adam blames Eve and blames God, and Eve blames the serpent, and I guess implicitly God, because God created the serpent, right? That we use other people, and then we can blame other people. Which is terrible. But I was also thinking, when you mentioned beautifying, this is something that I've thought about for a long time that I wanted to discuss with you, and this is where I want to bring up Frankenstein more, right? Is what people will often say is that something like Jurassic Park is a warning against playing God. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's the right way of looking at it. Because I think part of what the creation story is telling us is that actually playing God is kind of the whole point. All right? We are in the image of God, right? God creates the world, and it's good, but there is something unfinished about it. And then he puts Adam and Eve there as gardeners and says, go forth, and subdue the earth and multiply yourselves. In one sense, that's exactly what we're supposed to do, is play God, right? It's not, the earth didn't come ready-made for us. We're supposed to beautify it and cooperate with it, but that means respecting it. So it doesn't mean either a kind of nativism or primitivism, or an exploitation of it or a conquering of it. I was thinking the female character in Jurassic Park is named Saddler, which, like the name sounds like, I looked it up. It means a saddle, like a saddle. You ride a horse with a saddle, right? And when you're riding a horse with a saddle, you're not. You shouldn't be, right? You're not trying to subdue the horse to your own will, in a sense of where it has no autonomy of its own, because then it'll resist you, and you won't get anywhere. But also, you do need to sort of be mastering it. You sort of need to be in charge in some sense as a human being. So there's a cooperative ruling or something like that, right? There's a kind of just servant leadership or something like that of the horse when you're riding it with a saddle, I think that is really actually what we're called to as creatures of God, as image bearers of God, is to really play God. The problem is Hammond is not actually playing God. He's like playing Lucifer, right? This kind of counterfeit God who wants to have a absolute autonomy and use everything for his own self and selfishness. And not respecting the otherness of things and the givenness of things.
So are you saying then, if I understand you correctly, that the Jurassic Park, maybe even the Garden of Eden, is not so much that we decide to play God, it's that we did so in the wrong way. So in this distorted, perverted manner, we've lived out failed to live out our divine mandate. And not in the Baconian sense, but at least in the sense of living our vocation, divine vocation.
Yeah, I think so. It's not trying to play God. It's trying to usurp God, is what I get. Right? It's trying to again, you're rather than respecting nature, right? You're trying to take control of it. And maybe this is a good chance for me to read this quote from. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's I've shared it with you before, so I wanted to share it here. Michael Crichton actually explaining Ian Malcolm's worldview, because I think it explains this. Michael Crichton was probably a deist. It doesn't seem like he was religious, but he understood that he could tell there was design. And he did draw moral implications from that. So
Okay.
I'm going to read this excerpt from his website, God rest his soul, God have mercy on his soul, we pray he repented. But he talks about a deleted scene from the novel. Cause he's explaining, because he wrote the sequel, The Lost World, which was also adapted into a film. He talks about, he says, of course, so the rest of this is a quote, all right, from Michael Crichton. Of course, there is an ever-present theological aspect. In an early draft of the novel, Jurassic Park, Ian Malcolm, heavily sedated with morphine, expressed his belief about the choice God had made in creating the world. Malcolm said that in his view, God might have created a perfect world of immortal creatures where nothing ever changed. Such a world would be like an artist's painting, perfect just as it was at the instant of creation and never in need of change. But evidently, God had decided on a different sort of creation, because instead, God had created a world where change occurred, where creatures were born, reproduced, and died, where new generations took over and replenished the earth. And therefore, Malcolm concluded, God must have believed in the importance of change, not easy or frivolous change, because God's world was inherently conservative, and it resisted change. But nevertheless, hard-won change did occur, so the fact of change was central in our God-given world. But, Malcolm continued, nobody seemed to like that, or to accept it willingly. There were some people who refused to change anything for thousands of years, and other people who wanted to change every 6 months, like fashions. Either way was too easy, Malcolm said, because God had created a world that was tougher than that. God's world forced hard choices and did not permit easy answers. As originally written, Malcolm's long tirade put the others to sleep. I cut it late in my revisions because it just didn't seem to fit. But I always liked the speech, and I remain convinced that the world we are born into is a world of controversy, and that it behooves us to respect our adversaries and to honor them as expressing another aspect of God's will. Because in the end, evolution is a profound mystery. Life is a profound mystery. And we are fools if we forget that and think, even for a moment, that we know it all. So there's Crichton kind of just dropping in what his own perspective is, and I think that gets at it, right? It's not as simple as saying, well, you shouldn't play God, because if we never played God, if you take that far enough, well, we wouldn't do medicine, right? Oh, this person's dying. Well, we can't play God and try to help them, right? Well, no, God actually gave us intelligence and a sense of compassion for the express purpose of trying to help people in cases like that, right? Nor is it, though, that we can cure death, right? We can invent something that will prevent people from ever dying again, because that actually doesn't respect our moral limits. And probably there's also a chaos theory element where something would go wrong we didn't foresee, right? So there's that inherent conservatism. We do need to fight hard because there are changes that need to be made, but we also shouldn't think it's easy or natural or spontaneous to make changes to the world. It's a very intriguing little explanation from Mr. Crichton, I think. Dr. Crichton, like I said, he was a medical doctor, so.
Right.
But I don't know. What is your feedback about that? You think?
Well, I mean, just to echo what you're saying, that if we never played God, then we would never name animals or cultivate gardens, because what's the alternative to a garden? Well, it's wilderness.
Yeah.
Right. It's chaos, which is it bewilders, right? As opposed to something that is well tended, that has intrinsic goodness in it.
Well, it's two things. It's either a wilderness or it's a tower, right? It's you can abscond yourself altogether from the garden, right, and just build something that's completely your own, or you could leave it completely uncultivated, right? Yeah. In either direction, right? And neither of those are what Adam does, and I think you're absolutely right. Naming the animals, that's what scientists do.
Right. Yeah.
Come up with names for things. And speaking of scientists, this is where I wanted to transition to the source material for Frankenstein. It's always for Jurassic Park. It's always compared to Frankenstein.
Right.
Dare I suggest, despite not being written by a medical doctor or written by a 16-year-old girl, perhaps a better novel even than Jurassic Park. I don't know if that's controversial.
Right.
But
probably more widely read. I don't know, but
absolutely, yes. Well, who needs to? I guess it also had a movie adaptation, so maybe people at the time were saying, I don't have time to read Mary Shelley, I'll just watch Boris Karloff and his bolts in his neck, and which is a shame, because there's so much in the book. I mean, that's a whole maybe we'll even do another podcast about it because it's such a rich, interesting book.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And if you're not familiar with Frankenstein, the book, you have to wipe from your mind any ideas of the overly tall and laboriously moving
and grunting, inarticulate Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whereas the monster, as he's known in the book, is agile. He's tall, but he's also very swift and
extremely articulate.
And intelligent, very acute, right, or astute rather, and so this is the monster he's dealing with.
And so this is also what's often said about the novel Frankenstein, is that it's about why we ought not to play God. What's your take on that? Would you agree with that, or what is Frankenstein about? I mean, what it's saying. I mean, it's saying lots of things, but what do you think it's saying?
I think that, I mean, I can't help but view it within there's different layers to it within a matrix of there's different people who tell the story. So there's Walton at the outset, who's writing letters to his beloved Margaret, his sister, explaining this adventure which he is undertaking to find a north passage. So he's trying to a northern route through the Arctic near St. Petersburg, which is, or at least one of the letters he writes from there. Then, as they're in the northern regions of the eternal light, this area, exploring these essentially like a new continent, this is where they come across the monster, or catch sight of him, and in particular they pick up Victor, Frankenstein, the creator of the monster, who's pursued him to this ends of the earth. Now, then the story unfolds with Walton listening in after these series of letters to his sister, to Victor. And what's beautiful about the story is that at a certain point it shifts, and then the monster begins speaking. Yeah. And then, so you have this, almost like Russian dolls, right? So you have Walton.
Or it's like, bear with this analogy here. Okay. It's almost like taking parts of different people and cobbling them together into one thing.
Okay.
Right? The novel itself is a kind of Frankenstein monster, right? Especially because like most of the people telling the story are dead by the end of it.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Well, that's an interesting read on that. The one point I'm not as convinced perhaps about is that the novel is woven seamlessly, whereas the monster seems to have some issues, right, in his creation. So Mary Shelley seems to be much more...
Maybe she's hedging her bets in case you don't think the novel is seamless. I don't know.
Author, I think, than Victor. But in any case, and then it goes back out. So then it goes back out to Victor, and then Walton finally, in the end. And then the question is, well, we're overhearing this conversation between Walton and Margaret, who's back in England, representing the civilized world and so forth. Well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to be? Right? How do we understand what's developing here? So that's that kind of the big picture of what the story is about. It's our humanity's relationship, I guess, Western civilization and modernity, really. So the trajectory that we're going on, and it anticipates some important thinkers, but sums up this movement where if we are going to use our powers of reason and mastery over nature, to what end? To what end will this be?
Yes.
And so for Victor, he's quite explicit. I guess we can back up a little bit. He becomes absolutely consumed with knowledge. He digests Albert the Great, as well as Paracelsus and Agrippa. So there's these and alchemy he's into at the beginning. He's
not very interested in the medieval legends. He's not interested in justice, he says, or law or storytelling. He's interested in just like the secrets of nature, right?
Yes, and because that would give him power, right? And
so he doesn't have much of a humanities education, you could say.
It's very focused, laser focused in that sense for a particular utilitarian end, right? And so he's living out Bacon's adage of knowledge is power. And what does he want to use this for? Well, he soon finds out that those thinkers aren't going to get him what he needs, and he abandons them and becomes immersed in chemistry and so forth in Ingolstadt. But the whole idea, though, the purpose of what he's doing is that this creature that he will construct will bless him and become subservient to him, who is now a new god. And so this is very much in perhaps the Nietzschean framework mindset of becoming an Uberman or a self-creating god, or creating our own values and so on. Well, it's going beyond that. Here it's creating life and having mastery over death and bringing things back to life.
Because there's a sense that the monster might be immortal, right? Like it won't be able to die on its own. Because at the end it says it has to commit suicide, basically.
Right. Yeah. So that is part of the question: is what has he constructed if it's come back from death? And it's not. Yeah, I mean, it's left as an open question.
Yeah.
Open-ended question. I don't think Mary Shelley ever wrote a part 2, but unlike Michael Crichton. But that would be quite interesting if he was discovered in the depths of the Arctic, the Russian Arctic or something like this, preserved. But anyways, that'd be a story for another day. Maybe someone's already written that one, but maybe we'll have to write one on that. But that would be fascinating, wouldn't it?
It
rediscovered.
Yeah, I mean, if he survived today. Right, what would he make of today's world? But that's who Victor is. Now, what's shocking is that he doesn't even last 5 seconds as a creator. So you think of Lex Murphy, and so here he's made his creation painstakingly. He's ignored his family for 2 years, and longer, and he's severed his relationships. Basically ignoring them, and in this pursuit. But as soon as he finds success in what he's attempting to do, he abandons the project. He's hands off. In fact, he's absolutely terrified, and his whole fiduciary duty to his creation is not thought of one bit, one iota. Yeah,
and so. The monster then, certainly, that's what he becomes called, but at first we can be entirely sympathetic towards him, who, he opens his big yellow eye, and this is what perhaps is abhorrent to Victor, but he's reaching out to him, and Victor sees this as threatening. Maybe he just wants communion, right?
Yeah.
Maybe he just wants a relationship.
Yeah.
Maybe he's just... That's a natural reaction of something that's been created.
Well, it's like the Sistine Chapel roof, right?
Right.
Adam and God reaching out to each other, right? Isn't that what's going on here? Is
right
reaching out to its creator, right? It wants reassurance. It's like a newborn baby, right? Grabbing the finger of their dad or whoever's there, right?
Yes, that's right.
Center themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. Or a new hatchling, you want to follow Mother Duck, well, he wants to follow Victor, and Victor will have none of it. And so it's a fascinating process, whereas he follows the Lacey family, and he comes to gain knowledge and understanding through them about the world. But whenever he makes an overture to humanity, there's this immediate repulsion, immediate animosity, and this causes it's appropriated by the monster, who then lashes out and becomes destructive and ultimately mimics Victor in some profound ways, in that he becomes obsessed, just like his creator. He becomes laser focused on in this case, undoing Victor, and wreaking havoc and pain that in his life, right? Particularly when it comes to communion. So, in communion with others, we think of earlier we talked about sin and its effects on nature, our relationships, and God. Well, for here, particularly the monster is seeking out to eliminate the relationships or infect all of them that Victor has, whether it's with Justine or his his family members, and particularly, his fiancee Elizabeth, his wife, would-be wife, and so this is, his threat to him, as I will be with you on your wedding night, and so. Because, and the one major request that the monster makes of Victor is that he will have a partner, right? An Eve, essentially.
Yeah.
Where, and he, makes some assurances that perhaps believable or reasonable, that they'll go to South America somewhere and be unseen, maybe in Costa Rica, and they will keep to themselves and not be a disturbance to anyone, but he just needs some communion because humans are not cutting it, right? And so this is the prospect, and when Victor dashes these hopes, these possibilities, well, he comes after Clairville, and Elizabeth has mentioned, and this is the undoing. Notably, though, he doesn't actually come after Victor himself, which might be seen as perhaps too easy. As long as the monster is alive, he wants Victor to also endure the pain. And Victor then, his obsession continues, and this now it's eliminating or chasing the monster to the ends of the earth. And this is when, on his dying breaths, we meet him. That's how the story begins, and that's how the story ends.
So, given all that, is the story telling us don't do this? Like, don't artificially create life? And that's the message of the story, or?
Well, I'm not sure that's like I don't think that's actually the primary, because obviously it's science fiction when it was written. Now
there were experiments in galvanizing, though, right? People running electrical shocks through bodies to see if they could.
If this would take,
Yeah, well, especially as there was more secularization. Well, for example, her own husband, Mary Shelley's husband, was a famous atheist, and as there was the scientific revolution, as it was called, was going on. If there's no soul, if Descartes hasn't persuaded you that there's a soul and it's just a machine, well, the machine runs on electricity. Maybe we can restart that machine, reboot this machine. And there are like stories of scientists like getting the bodies of murderers who've been executed and like shocking them and reporting in their diaries like, well, his eyes opened and he looked like, he started to be kind of behaving like he was alive again, kind of like he was dancing and stuff like this. So, it was seen as something of a theoretical possibility, at least when she was writing. So is she saying, lay off that, don't keep trying this anymore, or what do you think?
Well, certainly that's what's being implied in the story. To me, I come at it more from the relationship angle, where if you are obsessed with knowledge, right, if you're going to sever all relationships, if you become completely consumed by a narrow project, it's going to wreak havoc on your relationships, the world around you, and so on. It's also a story of pride. Victor, he can't admit to his failings. You think of poor Justine, who's blamed for the death of William, and Elizabeth believes her, and Victor's obviously convinced as well. But when it comes time to defend her, he's silent. He's utterly silent. And then he thinks about how horrible things are for himself. Well, think about how horrible things are for Justine for a moment. And so he's utterly self-referential. They're self-reflexive. There's no concern. The concern that exists for the other is usually how it reflects back on him, or what it's going to do to him, right? And so
has he undergone a transformation that way by the end of the book, do you think? Because he's warning off Walton, right? Like, Walton is lonely out there, right? And he's kind of taken with Victor, like how sophisticated he is and how interesting he is to talk to. And
so this is part of the message. At the beginning, Walton is yearning for lack of a better term, a soulmate. He wants someone who he can see eye to eye with. He's the captain of the sailors. The sailors are certainly subservient to him. he doesn't find one, but he does find one in Victor. Okay, so this is the question. Is this the one you want to yoke yourself to? So Walton, who's off to discover these new continents, right, which allegorically can be read as a new moral order.
Yeah.
Right?
He's doing geographically what Victor did scientifically.
Right, and what Machiavelli does morally.
Right. Yes.
With virtue and virtue. And so is this who we want? Is this who you want your brightest mind, like say Walton, becoming intimate with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who this is going to be your guide for life? This is going to be your mentor? Mm-hmm. No, Victor has not changed whatsoever. He actually... okay, so towards the end there's a mutiny, right? Or would-be mutiny, where the sailors are saying, hey, look, we're about... This is life and death here. Next time the ice breaks up, we're getting out of here. You must turn the ship around in the next available moment. Yeah. Victor comes up with this brilliant speech following this, and very articulately explains in his accent, I guess, broken English, or maybe he's fluent, but in any case, think of the honor you'll win for yourselves, and your will must overcome, essentially paraphrasing her, matter, right? So it's mind over matter. You must be determined to this goal and set on it. Come hell or high water, right? Paraphrasing, of course. But that's essentially what he's saying. And what does that mean? Well, what does that mean? And again, the ship is a beautiful allegory for humanity. What does that mean for humanity? Well, what it means is Victor is willing to risk the death not only of Walton but all the sailors, right? He wants them to take on the project. He's handing on the baton. That's what he wants. He wants this singular vision to be followed, and damn the rest. So that's how he sees things. I mean, there's also this fascinating scene where he goes to the graveyard and visits. This is later on, with communes with his dead relatives, and it's this perverse communion of sorts. At least that's what he's led to believe. That these spirits are actually the lights guiding him through the darkness. So really, this is someone, and certainly that's Justine. I doubt that's what you'd be guiding him towards. Who dies a just death. But in any case, this is the demonic sense that he has of this communion, which he feels he's being led on by towards the end. So Mary Shelley beautifully puts that across. It's subtle, but it's there, that he's not just someone who's become infatuated with the periodic table of elements. He's someone who's communing with the dark forces, and in a righteous, seeing this as a righteous endeavor, which will be spared no expense, which sailors and Walton captains must also embark on. There is no turning back. And so this is... well,
it reminds me of like Ulysses in Dante's Inferno.
Okay.
Right? Who, his reinterpretation of Odysseus, right? Where he's in hell actually because of the sin of curiosity, right? He saw Mount Purgatory, and rather than leaving it well enough alone, he ordered his ship to go up and figure out what was going on, and that led to their ruin. And now they're in hell, and he's not climbing Mount Purgatory, right? If you want to climb Mount Purgatory, you've got to let Cato escort you, and all this. You got to let grace bring you there.
Right.
I don't know if Mary Shelley was thinking of that, but that's what it reminds me of. That the sin of curiosity being represented by this seemingly kind of bold, noble captain of a ship, propelling himself onwards beyond where he should be going, right? Trying to, it's like a hydraulic version of the Tower of Babel.
Okay.
Trying to sail your way up into heaven, almost.
Okay.
Like
this
that.
is this Promethean effort, or Pelagian in the sense.
it's a demonic, kind of Pelagianism. Yeah, I think there's, well, and of course this is, even though it's science fiction, it's a gothic horror.
Right. Yeah.
Frankenstein is the name of like a castle, right? That was famously kind of ominous and spooky. And the name Victor, of course, suggests like triumph, a conqueror, right?
Right. Yes.
Trying to defeat nature and subjugate her. Right.
Yes.
And of course, Mary Shelley is a woman. Her mother was a famous feminist of the time. So there must be some element of that going on too. That like Machiavellian toxic masculinity. Right. Conquer Fortuna. Right.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So I know you alluded to childbearing, I believe. We're talking about the Jurassic Park back there. So how might we read that in terms of a feminist critique of what Victor is about? This domination of nature for his purpose, where he's created new life celibately, right? He hasn't communed with Elizabeth or consumed their marriage in order to bring about.
Yeah, right. There is no consummation at all. Right. Yes, exactly. Well, so this is better in the movie, and I think this was probably done. I mean, I think Michael Crichton is more interested in the science than in humanity. Character development wasn't his strength. Whereas Steven Spielberg knows this is going to go over better with a general audience. So in the novel, Dr. Grant and Dr. Sadler are not involved. She's like his student. Yeah. And of course, as we know, graduate students never get involved with their supervisors. Right. But in the movie, they are low-key dating, you could say. Yeah. Near the beginning of the movie, they're on a dig. This is before John Hammond hires them to come check out Jurassic Park and give it the seal of approval. Yeah. And there's like there must be like a school field trip or something, because there's children there, and there's a kid who says, he says, I don't think dinosaurs are all that scary. And Dr. Grant takes out the claw of a dinosaur and explains how, if that dinosaur were alive today, here's how it would have disemboweled you. And essentially traumatizes the kid. Yeah. And Dr. Sadler says to Dr. Grant, she basically kind of chides him for it, like, you've traumatized a child, and he admits, I don't like kids, right? Like, I'm just not a kid guy. Like, I'm more comfortable digging up bones than I am like raising children. Then, of course, they go to Jurassic Park, and that's the same weekend. Very fortuitous, very from a storytelling perspective, but the same weekend or whatever that Dr. Hammond's grandkids are visiting, and he wants them to have the first ride, and their parents are getting a divorce, right? So he wants them to have a good time, and everything, of course, goes sideways. Lex Murphy, true to her name, this all happens, and that puts them in a situation, Dr. Sadler and Dr. Grant, where they have to protect and rescue these children. Specifically Dr. Grant, actually, in the movie, because Dr. Sadler's off with Hammond and the others. So it's Dr. Grant and the two kids are essentially separated from the rest of the party for much of the second half of the movie. Yeah. And he has to single-handedly protect them. And he has to use his knowledge of dinosaurs that he has as a paleontologist to say, their vision is based on movement, so don't move. Or don't be scared of these animals. They're herbivores, so they're not going to eat us. We can play with them. And this group of dinosaurs, they're traveling in a bird-like flock formation, so they're going to come this way. He's relying on this, and in the course of it, he has to become more paternal. Right, he has to learn to protect these two vulnerable kids who are also less annoying in the movie than they are in the book. They're a little more, they're a little cuter and easier to sympathize with, and the boy especially is a lot like Dr. Grant. He's very he loves dinosaurs. He loves reading about dinosaurs. He's already very knowledgeable. Yeah. And Lex herself is a bit like Dr. Sadler. Like, she physically looks a lot like her in the movie. So Dr. Grant is forced to be pulled out of himself. Right, he's sort of on the trajectory towards being a bit of a Victor Frankenstein himself, but being put in a situation where he has to protect these two children makes him paternal. It makes him family oriented, and in the end has this implication as they're being airlifted off him, and Dr. Sadler give each other a kind of look like, maybe we could have kids, maybe we could be a family, right? Yeah. I think that I've given the allegorical meaning of Jurassic Park. I think that's a bit of the moral meaning, right? Is the way out of this dilemma, this selfishness and this utilitarianism that led to the fall of humanity and the fall of Jurassic Park is self-denying otherness. The character, this is a famous scene in the movie, the lawyer who's originally in the car with the two children, when they see the T-Rex, he abandons them, runs for his own safety, he runs and hides in the bathroom. Yeah. And the T-Rex gets him anyways. And he dies very humiliatingly, right? The T-Rex tears off the roof of the bathroom and bites him off the toilet, and whereas Ian Malcolm actually distracts the T-Rex. Like, he runs out with a torch, right? So they said, protect the kids, and he runs off, and in the book, he's killed, actually. Like, that's when he gets attacked by the T-Rex and they put him on morphine and he gives his speech about God and he dies.
Yeah.
In the movie, he survives because he was popular and gets to star in the sequel.
Okay.
But and then that leaves Dr. Grant to protect the kids. And there's a kind of family quality. In fact, it's almost, because they're not his biological kids, and I'm aware I'm pushing this, but it almost reminds me of St. Joseph. You know, this figure who's not the biological father of the child, but is put in a position where he has to protect them, right? And again, it's entirely there's no genetic self-interest here, because animals, of course, will protect their young because there's this evolutionary impulse towards, right? But he doesn't have it. It's not an animalistic thing. It's a human. It's a rational thing. The moral, rational thing to do here is to protect these children, even though they're not mine. Right, and to take a paternal role towards them. He's not just protecting them; he's teaching them too, right, about the dinosaurs and how to protect themselves and so forth. And actually, come to think of it, near the climax of the movie, the end of the climax, there's a scene where they're trying to Dr. Grant and Dr. Sadler are trying to keep the dinosaurs out of the room they're in, and they're clearly having no success. But Lex is into computers. So she knows how to reactivate the security system, right? Yeah. So by virtue of saving the girl, he's ended up saving himself, right? Because she's the one who's able to ultimately, it's a very satisfying movie ending, as opposed to that selfish, like creating something without any regard for it, and then it turns on you, right? And why wouldn't it, right? You were self-interested, so it would be self-interested as well. Like, this is one thing. This morning, actually, I was up early this morning, and I was reading a bit about Frankenstein, and before the famous movie that you mentioned, there was a 12-minute silent movie from 1910. It's on YouTube. I'm like, I'll watch that and see. And the monster's a lot scarier looking than Boris Karloff. He's go look him up. He looks very deformed. Very silent movie weirdness. But what's interesting is the intertitles say they're very clear that the reason this monster is evil is because his creator was evil. Right? He had an evil mind, right? And so if God created us in His image and He's good, well, we're a little bit evil. So if we create something, it'll be a little bit evil too, presumably. Like we'll put a bit of ourselves into it. And it reminds me of what you said, right? Frankenstein's monster becomes like Frankenstein. He becomes single-minded, and then he wants to, he wants a companion as well. And I mean, this is the point I really think of. The point I think Mary Shelley is saying isn't so much like, don't do this. It's inherently wrong to create new life. It's, if you're going to create new life, you've got to think about a whole lot of things. And Victor Frankenstein's not thinking about them. Like, it didn't occur to him, like, oh, this guy might want a community. Because Victor Frankenstein himself doesn't think about community. He might want community with me, or he might want a wife. Right. And therefore he just didn't. It's like chaos theory. There's all these things that are unpredictable.
Yes.
And he starts to kind of realize that, because when he starts to design the Bride of Frankenstein, he realizes, well, wait, she'd have free will. Right. And so she might not be attracted to this guy. Right, or she might, or whatever, right? Like, she might not just obediently be his helpmate, right? So instead, he kind of performs a kind of abortion almost, right? By tearing it apart. So he realizes the limits of chaos. He kind of has this Malcolm moment, but he has it too late. Right. And I think that's the real point. Is like, if you're going to, like I said, I don't think the point of either of these books is don't play God, like don't be scientifically ambitious. But the point is, you've got to know your limits, because there will come a point where you'll unleash something. You'll open a Pandora's box where you just won't have the knowledge necessary. You'll be touching on things that are way beyond your ken, and you've got to respect those limits. You can touch the tree, but don't pull the fruit off it. Right. It's kind of what I get from these books. And don't be exploitative. I was reading a bit about sort of analogies to Frankenstein today. And there's an interesting one. And Michael Crichton, I haven't read this book, but he wrote a book about genetic engineering of humans. It was his last published book in his lifetime. But so this is intriguing. Okay, so in the 80s, I think, or late 70s, early 80s, there was a construction worker who had leukemia, and he was treated and he was cured. But he found out afterwards that his cells and the samples were being used. They'd been basically patented. Like, they'd been used to develop a cell line. And they were profiting off it, right? The University of California. And he sued, and the Supreme Court held that he had no proprietary right to parts of his own body after he had given them to the doctors. So he did not profit at all off of this, right? And what's interesting is that the most effective research against cancer has been done with the cancer cells of an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks. They developed a cell line based off her cancer cells called HeLa. And it's funny, the names of these things are immortal cell lines. That's literally their scientific name, because they take these cells and keep them alive. Right. And like just basically keep like perpetuating them.
Immortally. Okay.
Immortal. That's their formal name, is immortal cell lines.
Yeah.
And the HeLa ones are especially interesting because they're aggressive. A big problem is that if you store them in a lab, they'll actually contaminate other cell lines. Okay. So there's been a lot of scientific research that's actually had to be scrapped because the HeLa cells have contaminated them.
Okay.
And so there's something almost Frankenstein-esque about that. And what's interesting is her family, like, she wasn't told about this, and her family has not been compensated. Right. Because again, legally, like, her family has no proprietary right to her body.
Okay.
It makes me think, I was looking at the catechism as well on this, because Victor Frankenstein, as mentioned, right, he's a what you call a body snatcher. Right. And he goes into the graves and takes, and so I went to the catechism where it talks about respect for the dead. This is paragraph 2300. The bodies of the dead must be treated with respect and charity in faith and hope of the resurrection. The burial of the dead is a corporal work of mercy. It honors the children of God who are temples of the Holy Spirit. And the next paragraph says, autopsies are morally permitted for legal inquests or scientific research. The free gift of organs after death is legitimate and can be meritorious. The Church permits cremation provided it does not demonstrate a denial of faith in the resurrection of the body. So you have to treat bodies with respect out of acknowledgement of the resurrection of the dead.
Right.
Which obviously Victor doesn't. He's trying to thwart death by science. Yeah. Right? So he's using, he's basically treating, the remnants of these dead bodies. He can use them. He can use them to conquer death. Yeah. Just like the cancer cells of Henrietta Lack are, they were just taken from her, and they're being used, and they're still alive, and they're aggressive. Right. Apparently, who knows what could happen with all of that, right? There's a social justice aspect to this too, but it really does go to like why that is the seventh corporal work of mercy, is to bury the dead, right? And to understand this idea of what does it mean to? I mean, I understand it's a complicated legal question, right? Like if someone gives you a haircut, do you own the hair, or do they own the hair? I mean, I know there's complicated legal issues there. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but what I'm suggesting is that might be related to, again, to grasping after that fruit. Right? Like let's before we reach out to touch the tree, let's just, what are the limits? Yeah. What are the moral obligations that are put on us? If like with cloning, the question for me with cloning, some people are like, would clones have souls? Which I think is stupid. Yeah. Frankenstein's monster clearly has a rational soul. Right. Yeah. We'll talk about AI in our next episode. That was debated
in our recent class.
Interesting.
Extensively, but in any case.
Well, maybe we'll talk about that when we get to AI. Can AI have a soul? We'll get into this more.
Okay.
But to me, that is less the issue. It's not would it have a soul if we made it. We make beings with souls all the time. It's called childbearing. If we did it that way, that raises so many problems. And the novel exemplifies that. Frankenstein's monster doesn't have a family.
Right.
So if you create a rational soul, like Victor Frankenstein, he's almost like the first deadbeat dad. Right? Something, right? Like he creates this thing but doesn't want to provide for it anymore, right? Yeah. That's the real issue. Is if we, and even Hammond, he creates the dinosaurs, but he doesn't really have a plan like for them, right? For their own, and of course they're going to be self-interested to the extent that they can be with their reptilian brains. They're going to want to preserve themselves and propagate themselves, and as Ian Malcolm says, life will find a way, right? Yeah. So it's not that respect of the other for its own sake. Right, as a gift from God. Yeah. I think that's more the issue, more so than like, should we ever play God? Right. If we want to play God, we play God. Well, God creates and loves us and stays with us and tries to save us and devotes himself to us. Right. So that's what we should be doing with the environment and with our world. Right. We absolutely should be playing God. We should be lovingly, reverently studying it. Yes. And like you said, I love that verb, and beautifying it. Right. That's really what scientific work should be dedicated to. Yeah. And beautifying it doesn't mean turning it into a theme park. Right, or trying to thwart the natural moral limits of death or something like that. Right, it should be, which is why it's so wonderful. The monster understands that better than Frankenstein, because he does have a classical education. Right, he's read Paradise Lost, and got the point.
Right. Yes.
That poem about the fall. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, anyways, those were some of the thoughts I had.
Yeah,
so
I think, to bring our discussion here to wrap things up a little bit, it raises a number of points I think worth pursuing. Recently there's been talk about limiting research on AI and so on. So I think
Right,
maybe we can get into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also this disposition of gift, right? And seeing what is our vocation here on earth in this created order in which we find ourselves. Again, it doesn't have to be here. We don't have to be here, but we are. And not only that, God has revealed to us in the fullness of time what it means to be fully alive, right?
Yeah.
And through communion with His Son, then look what we have at our disposal, right? Of this life that we can live. And so, given all that, what are we going to do with our God-given abilities, our gifts, right? Our talents, as we call them, right? Or our talent, right? Of course. So,
well, and what's wonderful is, the tragedy of the monster is he finds his creator, and the creator hates him, doesn't care about him. But what I wish he could have learned is, okay, sure, the guy who built you doesn't care about you. Again, it's like, it's like meeting your dad and finding out he doesn't care about you.
Yeah.
But there's still a God, right? There's still a God who loves you. And this is why there's these sci-fi scenarios of like, what if aliens planted us on Earth to be their slaves or something like that? Like, even if that turned out to be true, and I mean, of course, Darwinian evolution, it kind of looks like a callous, blind watchmaker made us, even if that were the case, and we seem to have evolved, right, aimlessly and violently. The arguments for God's existence and the revelation of Jesus Christ show me that behind that, there's an ultimate creator who loves us and is involved with us. And, it's not just that he responds to us reaching out, he reached out first, right? Like Adam. Adam is just kind of like lazily lifting his finger, whereas God is like plunging after him, right? In that piece of work. Yeah. And so, no matter what our immediate cause of existence is, right? The first cause loves us and is available to us to provide us with that community that we need as rational beings, and to give us guidance about and here's the mission that I have for you, and here's how you can use these things that I've created as a gift.
Right. Yeah. As opposed to Victor's words, calling him a vile insect, right? He wants to step on our crush or a demon, right? That's Victor's take on. And
it's really his assessment of himself, right? I mean, there's an interesting thing there. There's almost a Jekyll and Hyde thing, right?
Okay.
Where if you think about it, the monster always kills people when Victor's asleep or sick or or dreaming. And I don't think. Obviously, we see the monster at the end, so I'm not suggesting like, the monster's all in his head or he's in a split personality in a literal sense. But symbolically, again, Victor creates him. He's a reflection of Victor. So what he hates, and he even says like, I tried to build him to be as beautiful and wonderful as possible, but then when he came to life, I realized I didn't like it anymore. That's really a reflection of himself in some ways. Like, he's assessing his own. He's the vile insect, really, in a moral sense at this point, in need of forgiveness and repentance.
Which connects to an assignment we have related to Frankenstein, but it's with Faust and comparing that situation where Mephistopheles is. I mean, in some interpreters, which is not really convincing, but see it as a projection of the dark side of his mind, essentially, right? So if that's the case, which is not really convincing, but it is an interesting way of thinking of the relationship between the two. Right. He's the dark half, the side of his mind.
I mean, if you want that, just go to Jekyll and Hyde, which I think does that better, but if that's what you're looking for. But So with that being said, I think that this is a nice. We'll call this part 1. Part 2, we'll pick up on AI. We've designed intelligence. We've put ourselves into it. What does that mean for AI and the soul of AI? I think we can adjourn this meeting. Let's say that we're not finished. We're going to pick this up next episode. So,
did you want to close with a prayer, maybe?
Sure, absolutely. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, thank you so much for the gift of this world and the gift of ourselves. Thank you for the love you shower upon us. Thank you for the revelation of yourself in your Son. May we always receive the gifts you give us and use them in a way that images you to others. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Saint Albert the Great, pray for us. Saint Isidore, pray for us. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Amen.